The phone vibrated against the countertop like an alarm I couldn't afford to ignore. I was halfway through folding a tiny uniform, 2 little sets of camo the size of my palms, when the notification popped up. Deployment orders pending, final briefing tomorrow, wheels up in 2 weeks. I could hear the twins in the next room, their laughter chopped into high, impatient bursts. Lily had just learned how to stomp in time to a cartoon drum beat. Lucas was trying to teach her to share a crayon and failing gloriously. All I needed was one thing, someone who would say yes. I dialed my parents before I finished the last fold. They had been the answer to so many of the small, ridiculous, impossible things in my life. Babysitting during residency deadlines, snowed-in weekends when flights were cancelled, one-off checks to help with an insurance bill, little loans meant to be temporary that became a soft habit between us. I'd given it without much thought, because that's what daughters do, because I thought they loved me, because it seemed easier than questions. My dad picked up on the second ring. His voice was warm, in the way it always was when he pretended not to be busy. "Everything okay, kiddo?" I told him. 2 weeks. Final medical. Uniform pressed. My voice was steady, but my stomach felt like it had swallowed a knot the size of my first ultrasound. "We need someone to watch Lily and Lucas for deployment," I said. Are you and Mom able, even for the first 2 weeks?" There was a beat long enough to let me think for both of us, a laugh that had no humor in it, a surrender I hadn't expected. "We've got plans," my mother said when she took the phone. "You know how Vanessa's coming over. We can't just upend everything." I tried to find gentleness in my tone. "They're 3, Mom. I'm literally leaving the country. I can't take them on a plane by myself with the paperwork and then the text. It arrived seconds after I hung up. I read it in the light of the kitchen, the foam still on my hands from the sink. I looked down at my phone and felt the house tilt. "You've always been a nuisance and a burden." Those words hung there like a foreign object in my mouth. Not even a comma, not even a period, just a sentence that made everything snap into place. I had imagined a lot of rejections over the years. I'd never imagined being reduced to language so small, so efficient at making me feel worthless. For 8 years, I'd been the one to smooth out the family's rough edges. I paid the furnace repair. I sent checks when insurance lapsed. I covered a mortgage payment during one awful winter when my parents argued about money and did nothing. I told myself each time that I was helping the people who raised me. I told myself I was being generous. I told myself it was love. Now it looked like bookkeeping. When you get a text like that, it's not just the words that hurt. You begin to catalogue every small kindness you've given that now looks like an invoice. The countless Sunday dinners I skipped to babysit Vanessa's kids so she could get to auditions. The months I parked in the garage behind their house and built IKEA cribs at midnight. The bank transfers that left my account like tidewater, regular, inevitable. I pulled up my records, hands shaking. Spreadsheets are cruel in their precision. 8 years, regular transfers to the same account labeled with benign notes. Help, loan, house. A sum that, when you stacked it up, looked like a second mortgage paid in installments. When you're young, you imagine giving and giving until the well is bottomless and the people you love never notice. But people notice in quiet ways, how they ask for more, how they assume, how they need you into their comfort. There is a kind of slow extraction that looks a lot like affection until the day you need a favor, and your worth is measured by the convenience of your help. I didn't call back. I didn't want to hear them argue about plans or making excuses. I sent one text to my sister instead, trying to keep sound and fury out of my fingers. Vanessa's reply came fast, as if she had rehearsed this moment in another life. "Military's dramatic," she wrote. "You always overdo things. Maybe don't make a spectacle." Overdo, spectacle. The words smeared like oil across the small moments I'd held sacred. She had always been the center of their attention, dressed in nicer clothes at graduation, praised for choices I'd made from the shadows, given explanations when I asked for help, and offered nothing in return. The family dynamic had a favorite and a fallback. I had been the fallback. I called Marcus instead. Marcus had been there since residency. Steady, plain-spoken, a man who made coffee taste like strategy. He was not family, but he'd strapped in with us when the twins came home from the hospital, bringing casseroles and an air mattress. He could be counted on to bring order. When I told him the text, he didn't get dramatic. He didn't say the words I wanted to hear. He said, "Okay, we'll fix it." He showed up 30 minutes later with a duffel and a ridiculous amount of confidence. He watched the kids like a hawk and listened to me rattle off a to-do list as if I was assembling the last minutes before a launch. We booked a sitter, someone with references, someone who would take a triple rate for last-minute work. I signed the authorization forms, scanned them, and slid them across the table like contraband. Marcus checked the locks and packed the playpens into the car. Everything practical fell into place, because that is what you do when your heart is bruised, but you still have obligations. The twins need dinner. They need to be fed and bathed and tucked in. The world does not stop because your family has shown its true colors. After we had the logistics sorted, I did something I had been avoiding for years. I called the bank. It felt almost ceremonial to press the buttons on my phone, to change the status of an automated transfer that for the last decade had been as steady as the seasons. I cancelled the scheduled payments. I set the accounts on hold. I changed passwords. It was not dramatic, no scenes, no shouting, but for the first time in a very long time, I drew a line. A line is a strange kind of comfort. It is a promise to yourself that you can stop being the dam everyone leans on. It is also terrifying. Guilt has a way of echoing louder than relief, and I spent the night awake, replaying the faces of my parents and the exact cadence of the text that broke something inside me. "What about the house?" I asked Marcus at 2 a.m. He was awake on the sofa, twins snoring softly, a coffee stain on his shirt. "You helped that house survive a long time," he said. "Maybe it's time the house stands on its own." I wanted to believe him. I also wanted my mother to say she loved me without an attached ledger. I called Aunt Eleanor the next morning. Eleanor had always been a quiet channel in the family, a woman who didn't shout, but who kept receipts in wallets you didn't know existed. She had been the one who noticed things, who kept an eye on Grandpa Thomas when memory blurred a little. When I told her the text, she didn't gasp. She didn't counsel me to forgive. She said, "You should get everything in writing." And she meant it literally. "Get the transfers," she said, "and the schedule. If you were handing them money for years, make a copy. Make sure you have it." There was a strange, discreet cruelty to bureaucracy that evening. I sat at my kitchen table at midnight again, my laptop light a small halo, and dug through years of bank statements. I printed the ones that mattered, monthly transfers, occasional lump sums, the night I covered a roof repair when rain threatened a winter. It was tedious, but it made the story I'd been telling myself into evidence I could hold. I labeled the folder with a permanent marker, Household Assistance 2012-2020. It looked clinical and final, like a file that belonged in an office where things are decided. Grandpa Thomas called the next morning and asked me to come by. He lives in a small house with an old porch that squeaks when you step on certain boards, the ones he always used to fix with his hands. He had always been different, less performative than the others, quieter, with a reluctance to choose sides that I mistook for apathy. I would learn later that he had been keeping a ledger of his own. "I want to look at a few things," he told me over the phone. "Bring what you have." When I arrived, he was sitting at his little kitchen table with a black coffee gone cold. He slid a manila envelope toward me. Inside were notes in his looping handwriting, dates, amounts, comments like helped with gas and paid for furnace. He had been tracking some of the transfers for years. His eyes were rimmed with a tiredness that did not belong to a man who had once carved wooden toys with calloused hands. "I kept a record," he said. "I thought I might be losing my mind, but the numbers don't lie." He wanted to do something I had not been ready for. "I want to make this public," he said. "At the reunion next weekend. I don't want them to get away with this anymore." The family reunion was months away, on a calendar we always treated like a social safe zone. Barbecues, applause for graduating nieces, the kind of weekend that held the family's image together. It felt dangerous to imagine tearing into that fabric. Grandpa's suggestion was radical, not for its theatrics, but for its finality. He wanted truth to be irretrievable. "You'll be gone," he continued. "You're deploying. I can find someone to read it aloud. I'll put everything in order." "And who?" I asked, half joking. "The general," Grandpa said. His eyes were bright with some private memory, and I realized he meant the retired officer who lived down the street, the one the town invited to speak at Memorial Day parades. He wasn't close to our family beyond casual hellos at the grocery store, but he had stature, a voice people listened to. Grandpa wanted the authority of someone who carried a uniform in public, someone who could lend a kind of ceremonial gravity to what would otherwise look like an accusation. It sounded theatrical. It sounded exactly like the kind of thing that would get people's attention. It also felt like a pragmatic move, a way to make sure what we had done was seen and registered. "I don't want to cause trouble," I said. "I'm not trying to humiliate them." "You're not making them do anything," he said. "You're letting people know what you already did." We talked for a long time at his kitchen table, the sun slipping across the floorboards, twins' toys strewn like islands. He asked about the folder. He asked about the transfers. He wanted to know exact numbers. He asked me to write a short statement, something that said why I was doing this, that it was not a spectacle, but a line drawn for my children and for my peace. Saying the words out loud in my head felt different than writing them on a page. I wrote, "I am doing this because my children deserve stability. I am doing this because I will not allow my parents to reduce me to bank statements. I will not hand my children a legacy of entitlement." It was blunt. It felt like breaking a bone and putting it back together. When I left Grandpa's house, he pressed his fingers to my hand with the slow deliberation of someone who had been taught to be careful with touch. "I'll ask him," he said. "I'll ask the general. He'll do it properly." The word properly sat heavy between us. It meant dignity. It meant formality. It meant that the revelation would not dissolve into gossip or petty shouting. It would be said in a room that expected civility, with a voice that carried beyond the family's small circle. I went home and tucked the twins into bed and packed my own bag. 2 weeks from then, I would be on a plane leaving my small life behind to serve in a role that felt simultaneously enormous and mundane. Work hours, briefings, other people's needs. My service had been a source of pride and a source of competition in my family. To them, it was a shimmer, something they could wear when it suited them. To me, it was a set of duties and a promise. 3 days later, my mother texted me again. This time, it was a barrage of small, cutting questions designed to remind me of where I had fallen short, of the inconveniences I had caused. I read them in the laundry room, folding socks, hands moving on autopilot. That night, Vanessa called. Her voice was bright with performance. "You're being dramatic," she said. "Making a scene before deployment isn't a good look." I could feel the walls tilt. People rehearsed accusations like scripts. "It's you, not us. You're unstable. You're causing drama." It would have been easy to back down. It would have been easier to pick up the phone, to send the money back, to wink and say everything was forgiven. I had done that before. I knew how to make myself small until I fit into someone else's narrative. But each surrender had cost me something I couldn't easily name. A quiet disappearance that left me wondering which of my choices had ever been truly mine. Instead, I replied with facts, dates, amounts, the exact phrasing of the automated transfers, the small notes in ledger margins. I sent screenshots and bank statements and the letter I'd written to Grandpa. Vanessa's response was the kind of dismissal that looks like civility. "You're making this public for attention," she said. "This is mean." The twins were asleep upstairs. I sat in the dark of my living room, the hum of the refrigerator a low companion, and let the accusation wash over me. I felt the sharp edge of old shame, the shame that sets in when the people who taught you who you are call you a problem. The night before my final briefing, I drove to my parents' house one last time. The porch light was on, a weak circle over the walkway. Inside, voices low. I stood on the step and listened the way I used to when I was 10 and wondering if I was in trouble. My mother's laugh came through, easy and loud, and then Vanessa's, high and bright. The sound of it made my stomach quiver. I rang the bell. They came to the door like actors summoned for the next scene, faces smooth. My father's smile was practiced in a way that left my throat tight. For a moment, the old script played out. Small talk, a question about the twins, the polite exchange of small civilities. I held the manila folder by its edge, the papers inside, crisp and ordered. "I'm leaving tomorrow," I said. "I need to know who's watching Lily and Lucas." My mother's eyes slid to my hands, as if the paper itself was an accusation. "We told you," she said. "We have plans." I showed them the text. I waited for the denial, the explanation, the apology. The silence that followed was heavy. It was not denial. It was the space you leave when you have no words that will make the facts go away. "You've always been a nuisance and a burden," my mother said again, quieter this time, as if saying it aloud might steady her. The sentence had the effect of an answer you didn't ask for. It confirmed what the spreadsheet suggested, that affection had always come with an invoice, and utility had been mistaken for love. I left them on the porch with the light haloing their faces and the twinned flicker of their television through the window. I drove home in a fog of grief and resolve. Once the kids were in bed and Marcus had packed the last of my things, I called the bank and finalized the cancellation. I blocked their numbers. I printed extra copies of the folder and slid one into my duffel. I emailed copies to Aunt Eleanor and to Grandpa. I told the sitter where everything was. I left 3 sticky notes on the twins' door, one for each daily routine, one for medications, one for the emergency contacts, with my handwriting deliberately slow, like leaving instructions for someone who might be dizzy with unfamiliar responsibility. I didn't sleep. I listed every kindness I'd offered the family over the years, quiet acts that had become the scaffolding of their household. The list was long. It was almost cruel how detailed proof can be. It was also oddly liberating. Proof is not accusation. It's a map you can follow if you want to remake your life. The morning I left, Grandpa met me at the door. He had the folder and a small note tied with twine. "I asked the general," he said. "He'll be there. He said he'll read the letter. He wants this to be done respectfully." I imagined a room full of people at the family reunion. Faces I'd known since childhood, neighbors who complimented curtains, relatives who liked the idea of civility. I imagined the general's voice even, steady, reading facts like scripture. Dates, amounts, the words that had been sent to me in a moment I would never forget. I imagined the sound of the room as the truth landed. "You sure?" Grandpa asked, as if he didn't need to. "Yes," I said, "for Lily and Lucas." He pressed his hand against mine, slow and firm. "We'll make sure it's not spectacle," he said. "We'll make sure it's truth." I got into the car and drove to the airport with a duffel heavier than I expected. The car felt like a capsule of everything I was leaving and everything I was taking with me. I set the folder on the passenger seat like a talisman. When the twins waved through the window and the sitter buckled them into their car seats, Lily pressed her face to the glass and made a small, tentative heart with her fingers. My throat tightened in a way that made speaking impossible. I mouthed a promise, and then climbed into the taxi with the feeling that the world had shifted in a way that could not be undone. 2 days later, halfway to my base, a small message popped up in my inbox. It was from Grandpa. It read, short and oddly formal. I spoke with the general. He's agreed to read the letter at the reunion. My chest tightened. I was in uniform in a hotel room that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and lemon. Far away, in living rooms and backyard grills, a scene was being set that would make private numbers public. There were moments in those weeks when I felt ridiculous for expecting apology or recognition. The world asks something of mothers, to be service members and caretakers, to be disciplinarians and safe harbors, to hold the seams of a life together while people around them critique the color choices. We are taught to manage contradiction with a smile, but I had reached the edge of where smiling was possible. The rest of my deployment was a blur of briefings and mundane shifts. I checked my phone less and less. Every now and then a picture would come through, a sitter-sent photo of the twins asleep, arms knotted in each other. Those images were my oxygen. Meanwhile, the folder sat in Grandpa's care. He called me once a week with small updates. "I've organized it by date," he said. "There's also a copy for Aunt Eleanor. I spoke to Mrs. Cooper next door. She's willing to testify to your transfers if anyone asks." He was building a small architecture of proof and support without drama. It felt like assembling unlikely scaffolding under a trembling bridge. Inside the troop quarters, in the grey hours of night watches, I found myself rehearsing what I might say if people asked me why I did it. The truth was not a single thing. It was a messy cluster of needs. For my children, I wanted a legacy that started with boundaries. I wanted to be able to tell Lily and Lucas, when they asked why their grandparents were distant, that it was because sometimes love looks like holding people accountable for how they treat you. One afternoon, I got an unexpected text from Aunt Eleanor. A single line. "Grandpa's ready. Tell the twins' story to the general. Let the facts out." My heart climbed into my throat. It is odd, the way people who have never been part of your daily inconveniences can become your greatest allies in moments of reckoning. Eleanor had been quiet for years. Now she had become an instrument of truth. As the reunion approached, I arranged for a call with Grandpa and the general. The general's voice on the phone was steady and grave. He asked practical questions. He wanted to know the tone in which to read the folder. He asked to see the précis. He spoke like a man who had been trained to make words land without theatrics. "We'll keep it orderly," he said. "No shouting. Just facts." It felt strange and oddly comforting to have someone in a uniform affirm the manner of the reveal. The uniform was not there to dominate. It was there to lend a kind of formal witness. It made the truth less likely to be dismissed as petty family squabble. In the lead-up to the reunion, messages came in from extended family. Neutral, curious notes about whether I would be attending, whether the twins would be introduced. Vanessa texted more frequently. She offered thin compliments and more thinly veiled barbs about my choice to make the family's finances public. "You're going to make us look bad," she wrote. "You made us look dishonest by taking advantage of us." I wanted to write back. Instead, I typed, "I'm doing what I have to." The day before the reunion, I had a late-night video call with Grandpa. He showed me the folder through the screen, the paper edges like teeth. He told me the general would arrive early. He promised to be calm. "Will you be okay?" he asked. "Which part?" I asked. "The exposure," he said, "and the silence afterwards." I laughed softly. "I don't want them ruined," I said. "I want them accountable." Which was true, and a poor attempt at tempering my own fury. Grandpa's voice softened. "Accountability is a hard thing," he said, "but you're stronger than you think, Myra." I wanted to believe him. That night I lay awake thinking about what it means to make private things public. There is a weight to exposure that feels both like release and violence. Exposing the ledger would not erase the years of expectation. It would not force them to love differently. But it would alter how family members and neighbors regarded the narrative we all told about one another. It would convert whispers into facts. In the morning, a message showed up in my inbox, a single photograph. It was the reunion setup, tables trimmed in white cloth, the park pavilion framed by flags, the general standing nearby in a casual jacket with a presence like a lighthouse. Grandpa's note read, "We're ready." I closed my laptop and breathed. The twins were with a sitter who would take them to the park and feed them picnic sandwiches. Marcus had arranged his schedule to be there. Aunt Eleanor was already en route with her carefully neutral smile. I thought about the first time I'd sat on my mother's lap as a child, the way her voice had smoothed over the small storms of my life. It felt impossible to reconcile that memory with a woman who could call her daughter a burden with such economy. I thought about Lily's small hand, making a heart at the window, and Lucas's stubborn attempt to eat crayons. Those small, ordinary things were my measure of everything I'd done. My plane was due back the day before the reunion. I would step off and into the room where truths would be spoken aloud. I would watch people who had been complicit or willfully blind listen to facts that could not be folded away. I would stand in a place that felt vulnerable and refuse to back down. When the plane landed, my phone was full of one-word messages: support, curiosity. Someone had posted an old photo of Vanessa in a dress on social media and tagged our parents, a kind of performative normalcy. Another message was from Marcus. "I'm on my way. Kids are ready." I drove home with my duffel and the folder in the passenger seat like an artifact. The house smelled like rain. The twins ran to me and wrapped themselves around my legs in a tangle of sticky fingers and hair. Marcus shook my hand the way men do when they are trying to translate care into practical gestures. Grandpa called as I was buttoning Lily's jacket. "We're set," he said. "The general will speak clearly. There will be no yelling." I looked at the twins and felt something like the steady return of a fossil or a promise. This was not about humiliation. This was about drawing a boundary that would protect them. I left the house with the folder in hand. The park was exactly as the photograph had shown it. A neat pavilion, folding chairs in rows, a small stage. People milled about with paper plates and polite smiles. I found Aunt Eleanor near the back, her expression reserved. The general greeted us with a nod that had the curtness of someone who had spent a life giving and receiving orders. He had kind eyes. He had a voice that did not need to be loud to land. He shook my hand and said plainly, "We'll do this carefully." Grandpa stood beside him, the envelope like a small, loud thing in his palms. I could see my father across the lawn, an ordinary man in an ordinary suit, looking at the people gathering as if deciding whether to step into a light he had previously avoided. Vanessa hovered too, adorned in last-minute party finery, the way she always drifted into rooms to gather light. She pretended not to look at me, and then glanced, thin and sharp, with all the practiced fury of someone who expects blame to bewitch others, but not them. The moment was smaller than I had imagined. There were no microphones, no cameras, just neighbors and cousins, and a few old friends who had supported us through small tragedies. The general cleared his throat politely and asked for attention. I felt my heart move into the shape of a fist. He opened the manila folder and did what Grandpa had asked. He read aloud, in the manner of a man reading civic records, the ledger of transfers, the dates, and the phrase that had started it all. He read the amount as if it were a series of small drops falling into a bucket, piling steadily until the bucket overflowed. And then the line that had reframed my life. He read the text my mother had sent me. "You've always been a nuisance and a burden." When the words landed, there was a shift in the air. People who had been standing quietly found their mouths open. People who had been sympathetic paused. There was a hum like a kettle coming to boil. I watched my mother's face as if reading a map. She did not reach for the phone. She did not attempt to speak. In that moment, the ledger and the text were not just facts. They were the anatomy of a relationship unspooling. A voice at the edge of the crowd, my cousin's, murmured, "I had no idea." The general folded the folder closed and set it down on the small table like a verdict. He did not offer judgment. He offered the simple, unadorned authority of reading what had been written. And then I felt the cold, small thing that continues to happen when private finances and family intersect. People who had been comfortable with a version of us that fit their narrative were uncomfortable now. They shifted as if the ground had slightly moved beneath them. At that moment, a car door slammed in the distance, and the sound seemed to mark the place where the story would split. I felt both exhausted and distant, like someone watching an image projected on a wall. I drew in a breath. This was not the end. It was a beginning of a kind of public witness that I had not wanted but had chosen. People murmured. Someone asked a practical question about the repairs we had paid for years ago. Aunt Eleanor answered, patient and composed. My mother turned away. My father sank onto a nearby bench and exhaled, as if a weight had been set down, not rescued, but traded for consequence. Vanessa's face was a complex weave of anger and calculation. For a heartbeat, she looked like someone who might run toward us and scream, and then decided better of it. Grandpa patted my hand, as if to say quietly, "You did the right thing." The reunion continued in a new tone, no longer the same light-hearted parade of small affirmations of family glory. Chairs that had been set for congratulations were now seats for witnesses. Conversations split into small groups, some curious, some defensive. I felt a small, fierce relief. It was not vindication. I did not feel celebratory. I felt the gravity of having my truth acknowledged in a room full of people who had otherwise let me disappear into convenience. But even as the facts settled into the air, something else threaded through my skin, the ache of watching people I loved shrink in dignity. I had not wanted to make anyone smaller. I had wanted to tell the truth so my children would grow with clean ground beneath their feet. At the edge of the pavilion, someone opened a cooler and handed out lemonade. The ordinary rituals of a family afternoon continued against the backdrop of a quiet revelation. I stood with Marcus and Aunt Eleanor, watching small conversations bloom and die. The general had put the folder down on the table and for the moment left us to sit with what had been said. I felt both exposed and strangely whole, like a person who has finally taken a breath after holding it for years. I knew things would change. I knew there would be fallout in ways I could not predict, but I also knew I would not hand my children over to a narrative that taught them to confuse obligation for love. Grandpa squeezed my shoulder and said softly, "You did right." And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. We were only at the beginning of what that belief would demand. After the general shut the folder and the words settled into the hum of the reunion, people drifted back into whatever small rituals the afternoon allowed. Someone laughed too loudly near the grill. A toddler dropped a sandwich and dissolved into tears. The ordinary continued, stubborn as grass pushing through a crack in concrete, but the ordinary had changed shape. Conversations that had once skimmed the surface now picked at threads. Neighbors I'd nodded to my whole life avoided my parents' gazes. Cousins I'd only ever seen at holidays came over with cautious, curious questions. A few people approached me, quiet, tentative, saying things that sounded like apologies wrapped in wonder. "I didn't know," one woman said, and the surprise in her voice made me think of how many people prefer not to look too close at the ways families run on invisible labor. My mother left the pavilion before the lemonade cooled. She walked to the car and sat inside as if the leather could shield her. My father stayed longer, hands folded in his lap, staring at the place where the folder had been. Vanessa lingered in the periphery, her posture an argument between fury and calculation. She came close enough to brush past me and said, "Cool as a draft. You didn't have to make it public." "You did this," I said. "You chose what to say." She shrugged, the gesture of someone who'd been practiced at removing the weight of consequence from her shoulders. "Families have secrets," she said. "You don't need to air them." We could have gone on like that for a long time, accusations parried with more accusations, but the pavilion hummed with other people's voices, and the twins were waiting at the sitters for the relief of routine. Marcus took my hand and we walked away together. I felt both fragile and steadier than I had in years. The folder in my bag felt less like a weapon and more like a ledger you hand an accountant, dry, accurate, unavoidable. In the days that followed, the ripple of the reunion made itself into a current. My parents' invitations thinned. Households that had once treated them as the center started to avoid scheduling events in their living room. People who had shown up at their holiday dinners stopped calling to ask about recipes. It was as if once you changed the terms of a family's currency by showing how affection had been paid for, you make everyone re-evaluate their investments. They called once, about a week later. My mother left a voicemail that began with the syntax of an apology, but landed in a place that felt like negotiation. "We were surprised," she said. "Maybe this was extreme. We're old. We need help. Can we talk about a plan?" I listened to the message twice. It was not the sweeping apology I had half imagined in my loneliest nights. It was a small, practical request, wrapped in the same habits that had led to the transfers. Problem, request, solution. "Help us make a plan," was a way of asking me to resume the scaffolding I had dismantled. I didn't rush to respond. That silence was deliberate. The first weeks after the reunion were full of careful, almost surgical actions, things I had put off when I'd been too busy giving. I met with a financial counselor, not to get advice to litigate or to shame, but to map a way forward for Lily and Lucas that didn't rely on other adults' whims. We set up a college savings account in their names, a small emergency fund, and a shared calendar for childcare that included Marcus and Aunt Eleanor as trusted contacts. I wrote down automatic bills and scheduled them in a way that would prioritize my children's stability. Folding money away from people who had come to expect it felt like reclaiming a room in a house that had belonged to them for too long. It was slow and practical work, forms, signatures, the quiet clicking of a pen as promises were turned into paperwork. It didn't feel cathartic in a theater of consequences way. It felt like a parent doing what parents do, organizing safety. Word of the reunion spread beyond the park. Some family members called me to say they were surprised and sorry. Others texted to say that the incident made them think. A few messages were colder, more accusing. I had made them choose sides, they said. I had embarrassed the family, another wrote. Vanessa sent a lukewarm message that read like a press release. "I'm sorry this caused pain. There's always more to the story." I didn't want schadenfreude. I didn't want a litany of "I told you so" or the hollow taste of triumph. What I wanted was less glamorous. Clean ground for my children, neighbors who knew the truth, and a quiet life where gratitude and help were not the currency of affection. The parents' social circle contracted. People who had once offered casual loans and rides to the airport stopped coming by. The small municipal networks, book clubs, church committees, the bingo nights, found themselves awkward around my parents. Invitations dried up. At first these changes were murmur level. "They're having some trouble." Oh, you know how it is. Later, they became practical. My father started missing calls from men who had once expected him to arrange things at the community center. My mother began to answer her phone less frequently. They weren't punished by law or by anything formally adjudicated. They experienced instead the social consequences of being revealed to have relied on my labor, financial and otherwise, for far longer than they'd acknowledged. Without the automatic transfers, certain monthly expenses that had been covered quietly became their responsibility. I had no joy in watching them scramble. There was, though, a recognition that the comfort they had enjoyed for years had been subsidized. My mother did call again, this time with a different sound, smaller, softer, less theatrical. "I'm sorry for the words," she said, voice scraped thin with a humility I hadn't heard from her in years. I was ashamed, and I said something I can't take back. "I know what you said," I replied. "It's not just the sentence, it's the pattern." She paused. I could hear the rustle of newspaper, the domestic noises that always seemed to be background in her life. "Can we see the twins?" she asked. The question was practical and loaded. It was a request for access, for compensation, in the form of proximity. "I want visits to be safe for them," I said. "I want them to see you with people who will support that. I don't want them in the middle of an argument or to learn that love equals free labor." It was not an ultimatum. It was a boundary. She did not like it. She said so. There were conversations after that, texts flaring with old dynamics, a few attempts at reconciliation that read like rehearsed speeches. Vanessa, predictably, called me unstable more than once, implying the whole thing had been a dramatic ploy. Family members who had stayed neutral for years now oscillated between curiosity and pressure. "Can't you forgive?" one aunt asked me. "Isn't it better to keep things whole?" I realized the only way whole would be preserved was if I stayed in the position that had made me invisible. That, I decided, would not be the legacy I wanted for Lily and Lucas. Grandpa Thomas became my steady after the reunion. He started coming by with small, practical things, a jar of his homemade jam, a pair of gloves for the twins, a newspaper crossword he insisted I try. He rarely spoke about the ledger unless I asked. He would only say, quietly, "It needed to be said." Aunt Eleanor visited more frequently, and her habits had not changed. She kept quiet watch, like someone who had always held small truths and waited for the right time to release them. Marcus settled into a new role that felt less like a helper and more like chosen family. He taught Lucas to whistle loudly. He built a little bookshelf for Lily. He showed up at school events and said my name with the affection of someone who respected me. I was surprised by how rare courage really is. It is not the thing you announce in a grand speech. It is the thing you do when you are tired of carrying an unreturned weight. My acts of courage were small and boring. Sticking to a budget, cancelling a payment, fielding a text from a relative who wanted to know why I hadn't forgiven yet. But those boring acts had consequences that rippled outward. Vanessa's life continued in public view. She crocheted a life out of performance, gallery openings, holiday photos, a string of carefully curated social media posts. People still complimented her. Some still brought casseroles to her house. She had friends who rallied around her in ways that felt like a flocking instinct. I never wanted to take that away from her. I only wanted my children to have a model of how to be honest and accountable. Months after the reunion, my parents came to me with a request that surprised me. Their house was not in imminent danger of being repossessed or anything dramatic. This was not a legal horror story. But the small, consistent checks that had been a soft cushion for years were gone. Their refrigerator had a broken seal. Their furnace was on its last legs. They asked me, tentatively, if I could help arrange a repair loan. Not a handout, they said, but a way to get back on their feet. When their request arrived, I surprised myself by how measured my answer was. I offered a single thing, help connecting them with local resources and a small one-time contribution to cover a necessary repair, with a clear agreement that there would be no more automatic transfers. I wrote it down and sent it to them in an email, the details, the timelines, the promise that this was not forever. It felt like a parent teaching a child to swim rather than carrying them across the pool. They resented the terms. They wanted more. I stood by the line we'd drawn, the line that separated compassion from enabling. That distinction felt unromantic, but necessary. Time did not erase what had happened at the reunion. The ledger remained a quiet, legal-looking artifact in a file drawer at Grandpa's house. People still talked about the incident in hushed tones at church, in the church parking lot, in whispered segments that did not name names but described, with a sweetness of gossip, a family that had divided. Then something small and unexpected happened. A neighborhood repairman who'd worked for my parents for years came by one spring morning with a bag of cookies and a sheepish apology. He had been polite and cordial to them for years, he said. But after hearing the ledger read aloud, he'd gone back through his own records and realized he'd been swept up in a pattern that didn't feel right. He offered, quietly, to take on some light work and bill it directly to them, to give them the chance to re-establish responsibility in a way that didn't involve me. It was delicate. This slow conversion of others, from comfortable enablers to people making different choices. For me, it felt like witnesses finally stepping forward to help rebuild the social scaffolding in a way that didn't rely solely on my labor. There were also moments of unmistakable cruelty. A cousin blocked me on social media and unfriended me in real life at a picnic a month later, as if deleting me from a feed would make the ledger evaporate. Someone left a scathing letter pinned to a community bulletin board, thinly veiled accusations that I had used my service as a cloak for publicity. A small group whispered that public shame was excessive, that family business should stay private. Those stings landed, but they dulled over time. The more I focused on the twins and the life we were building, the less the peripheral noise mattered. Money redirected into their accounts felt both practical and symbolic. I began paying for things I had always assumed others would cover. Pediatric dental cleanings without having to guilt an adult into paying. A small tutor for a time when Lily developed math anxiety. A pediatrician who would see Lucas for persistent sniffles. I booked a small life insurance policy, not because I was morbidly planning for the worst, but because I wanted to ensure continuity if something happened. I don't spell out financial plans as prescriptions. This is my story. But these were the things that gave me a new kind of peace. The ledger had been a reminder that love without accountability can be fragile. The accounts I opened were boundaries built to protect my children's future. The emotional work was just as intense. I started going to therapy not because someone told me to, but because I wanted to understand why I had kept quiet for so long. The sessions were not about retribution. They were about learning how patterns pass from generation to generation and how to step out of them. I discovered the language to describe what had happened. Boundary erosion, conditional affection, emotional labor hidden as love. Giving the experience vocabulary was for me a kind of freedom. I could look at a moment and name it instead of letting it continue unnamed and therefore unchallenged. At the same time, I maintained a complicated compassion for my parents. People are not single motivations dressed in theatrical tones. They are messy. My mother has a way of speaking that carries the sounds of a woman raised in a family where silence and economy were survival techniques. She had used me as a resource, yes, but she had also been shaped by the same scarcity that had made those strategies logical. Understanding that did not excuse what she'd done. It helped me not to let anger be my whole personality. There were attempts at reconciliation, 2 in the first year after the reunion that felt promising, and 2 that did not. The promising ones were practical and boundaried. A supervised breakfast with Grandpa and Aunt Eleanor present, a short visit where Vanessa stayed in the house and didn't try to commandeer the conversation. The not promising ones were texted apologies that doubled as demands. "You made us feel ashamed," one read. "Can you not make us the scapegoats?" I began to set parameters on contact. I allowed phone calls, but with limits on length. I permitted visits that were focused on seeing the children. No conversations about finances unless they were prepared to speak in specifics. I insisted on neutrality from other family members when they commented on us in public. Boundaries like this are not dramatic. They are contract-like. They are agreements you make with people you love when you decide you will no longer accept being the safety net of their dysfunction. Marcus became, in small ways, a co-architect of the life we built. He and I never married. Our relationship was not that kind of story. He became a constant presence, someone who held the twins while I did briefings, someone who taught them how to throw a ball properly, someone who made pies on Thanksgiving. There are people who show up and ask nothing in return. He was one of them. He asked for nothing more than the chance to be helpful. He didn't want accolades. He wanted to be useful. Aunt Eleanor and Grandpa filled out the rest of the scaffolding. Grandpa took the twins for a Saturday afternoon each month, simple, ordinary time where he read them the same book until they memorized every page. He taught them how to identify different birds. He showed them how to hold a hammer properly. Those Saturdays were not about replacing the parents who were distant. They were about offering a steady, older presence who loved the children without strings attached. As the months turned, there were small, tender moments that made the hard choices feel worthwhile. Lily learned to ride a bike in the cul-de-sac near Grandpa's house. Lucas stopped needing the nightlight and started telling jokes that roped the whole family into laughter. They began to call Marcus Uncle Mark because he fit the word without trying to earn it. At bedtime, when the house was soft with the hum of a dishwasher and the twins breathing, I would sometimes sit and watch them sleep and feel an enormous, wordless gratitude. The public consequences for my parents settled into a new rhythm. They were no longer the default recipients of help, yes, but neither were they exiles. Life, as it does, rearranged itself around the new facts. Friends who felt betrayed by the revelation made their peace by stepping away. Neighbors who had been oblivious became allies in small, pragmatic ways. The community response was not uniform, but it was instructive. Once facts entered the world in a formal way, people who had relied on polite ignorance had to choose. Vanessa, predictably, oscillated between charm and anger. She tried once or twice to play the conciliatory sister at a party, smiling and handing me a plate of appetizers as if we were playing the same game. I accepted the plate, said thank you, and kept the conversation small. I refused to be drawn into being the sister who always rearranged herself to make someone else comfortable. That would have been telling my children that their mother's comfort is less important than other people's reputations. I could not do that. One fall evening, almost a year after the reunion, my mother came to the twins' school performance. She sat in a back row, small and almost invisible, folding and unfolding her hands like a person practicing presence. After the show, she approached me with a sincerity that seemed to have cost her something. She did not bring the ledger. She did not bring the theatrics. She brought 2 paper cranes, one a little crumpled, the other carefully folded. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I can't fix what I said. I can only try to be better for them." It was not the apology that absolved. It was a start. It was also the fact that change, when it happens, is incremental. I hugged her for a short, deliberate moment. I told her that accountability was not public shaming. It was consistency in action. She nodded, and I could see the years of habit in her face like familiar lines. There were things I lost. There were honors that once came my parents' way that evaporated, relationships that frayed. I felt grief for the version of my family that had existed when I was a girl, simpler, unexamined, artfully ignorant of uncomfortable truths. That grief was allowed to be real, alongside the relief that came with clarity. I also found unexpected gifts. People I had barely known offered help in ways that were completely ordinary. A neighbor brought over a bowl of stew when the twins were sick, and I'd had to miss work. A colleague drove to pick up a forgotten lunch. An old friend offered a small scholarship for a music class for Lily. These gestures were not glamorous, but they built a community around my children that felt intentional and reciprocal. Professionally, deployment continued to be both a source of pride and a logistical challenge. I returned to the base for a few rotations, and those intervals gave me perspective, an ability to watch my life from a distance and to see where patterns repeated. I stayed in the reserves for a while after my active duty obligation was complete, partly because the camaraderie grounded me and partly because the uniform was a reminder of the commitments I'd chosen for myself, not ones I'd inherited. One early winter evening, Grandpa called and said simply, "I'm glad you did it." The line crackled with cold air. "Not because I wanted to hurt anyone," he added, "but because I wanted our family to stop pretending." His voice was small, older, but firm. "You gave the grandchildren a different kind of inheritance," he said. "You gave them honesty." That phrasing, inheritance, stayed with me. It reframed everything. Sometimes people talk about inheritance as money and property, but what I had inherited and what I was trying to leave my children was dignity, the knowledge that people should be evaluated by how they act when you stop paying them. There were, of course, continuing family dramas. Vanessa married and later divorced in a public flurry of commentary that some family members used as a chance to replay old narratives. Others used it as an opportunity to pull her into better choices. My parents, for their part, oscillated in private between defensiveness and small steps toward different habits. They asked advice that they then sometimes ignored. They tried to mend in ways that were performative and in ways that were genuine. I met each new moment with the boundary I had set, open to change, closed to exploitation. Years hum the way years do. Money that had once funneled out of my account toward other people now sat in accounts with my children's names on them. A small cushion exists, enough that a broken appliance doesn't have to be a catastrophe, and a missed week at daycare doesn't have to mean a parent loses a job. My choices weren't heroic. They were the responsible parent decisions that had been deferred for too long. There were days when I still felt the ache, the phrase that had set everything in motion, "You've always been a nuisance and a burden," would linger like an unpleasant song in the back of my head. Sometimes, on nights when the twins were asleep and the house was oddly quiet, I'd catch myself retracing the exact knot of it. The text arriving, the kitchen tilting, the spreadsheets laid out like a surgeon's map. Those memories hurt, but they no longer defined the horizon of my life. Instead, small replacements took root. There were bedtime rituals that became sacred, a precise tuck-ins, a song that was slightly off-key but beloved, a silly recitation of the day's most absurd event. There were school plays and scraped knees and triumphs like Lily's first soccer goal and Lucas finally mastering the word because. These things, as ordinary as they are, were the repair work we did together. I did not tell the twins the whole ledger story in detail. Children don't need the accounting of adult failures. They need the narrative that protects them. When they asked why their grandparents didn't come around as much, we talked about respect and responsibility in age-appropriate ways. "Some people need reminders to be kind," I said. "And we keep our family safe." I found a steadier voice to tell that story as the years went by. When friends asked why I had done what I did, I found I could step into the explanation without trembling. I would say simply, I wanted to make sure my children grew up in a home where help comes without strings. That meant I had to stop paying for what should have been given freely. One afternoon, several years on, my mother came by with a thermos of tea. We sat on the porch and listened to birds. She apologized again, not with the dramatic arcs of earlier years, but with small acts, fixing a leaky step, mowing the lawn on a hot day, showing up to watch the twins' recital. She had shifted in ways that were uneven and incomplete, but present. "I didn't know how to be," she said. "I grew up where everything was an economy. I didn't see how I was asking you to carry that forever." I accepted that as a truth. I forgave, not because she had become perfect, but because holding on to only anger would have made my children inherit another cycle of bitterness. Reconciliation, when it happens, is a slow thing. It does not erase history. It marks where people have chosen to do something different. The general, who had done the reading that day in the park, stayed a respectful distance in our story. He would wave from time to time at the grocery store, nodding with the politeness of a man who had offered a public voice when it mattered. He once sent a short postcard to the twins with a brief note, "Stand tall." That small postage-stamped encouragement meant more than a great public speech. It was a line of support from someone who had lent his voice to ceremony and to truth. When I look back on the season that changed everything, I see that the hardest part of drawing the line was not the public reveal. The hardest part was knowing I might lose the version of my family I had once wanted to keep. But what I gained in return was clearer ground for my children, and a life that, while imperfect, was less playable by the whims of others. Not everyone in my life became a hero. Not everyone understood. Some people called me cruel, some called me brave. I learned to take both in stride and to measure my choices, not by other people's judgments, but by the quiet arithmetic of what kept my children safe. If you've ever been taken for granted by the people who should have held you up, I know how isolating it feels to imagine that speaking the truth will make you the villain. I can tell you that truth, once spoken with evidence and calm, has a way of opening rooms you thought were sealed. It does not always heal everything. It does not close the gap between the past and a different kind of future overnight. But it creates a path. Myra, if you are still the same woman who packed a duffel and set a folder on a passenger seat and boarded a plane, has become someone who knows the difference between love and used labor. The twins have learned, in the softest ways, that asking for respect is part of being loved. Grandpa sits with them and hums tunes. Aunt Eleanor brings pies that taste like forgiveness. Marcus still burns the crusts of his pies and still leaves them on the counter with a grin. There are days I still count the transfers in my head, not with bitterness, but with the clarity that comes from naming what happened. The sum is a number you can show people. The sum does not tell the whole story. No document can. But it is a fact that anchored a choice I had to make. You don't have to have a general read a folder in a park to reclaim your life. You don't need a public reading to set a boundary. But if you are standing on a porch holding a manila folder that feels like both an accusation and a lifeline, and you are thinking about the small person asleep inside who needs a different kind of inheritance, let this be permission. You can make a choice that protects them. If this story hit you in some corner of your life, if you've friends or family who need to see that boundaries are not betrayals, share it. Tell someone who keeps carrying other people's burdens that they can let them go. If you've been taken for granted, type truth in the comments. Let the word feel small and sturdy enough to hold a beginning. If you want more stories like this, true stories about setting boundaries, second chances, and practical courage, like and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs permission to stop carrying what isn't theirs. We do not have to be defined by what we give away. We can choose instead what we will build.